I'm going to introduce our speakers, and today we'll be talking about global supply chains. This session will essentially provide a deep dive into the topic, and we all know this topic has been top of mind for quite a few years now, with notable changes in US trade policy starting in early 2018, and then significant disruptions during the COVID pandemic. Many have argued that we are witnessing a retreat from globalization, and as a consequence, we should think very hard and try to understand what is happening to trade flows, what's happening to financial flows, how are US importers and exporters, and those globally as well, adjusting to the new reality. And importantly, and taking a step back, how do trade and finance come together to determine the new geographic footprint of global trade and global economic activity? So to help us think through these issues, let me turn it over to the paper presenter. We are excited to have Laura Alfaro, Warren Alpert Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School, present two of her research projects titled Global Supply Chains, the Looming Great Reallocation, and Bank Financing of Global Supply Chains. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks to the organizers for bringing me to a place with a beautiful sun. When I left Boston, it was miserable, it was raining, and so it's always appreciated to come to a little bit closer to the tropics. So I'm going to present, as Camelia said, two papers. One was a paper that we were commissioned for the Jackson Hole Conference, and in fact, I do thank the organizers because they suggested the paper. Some of you may have seen it. Apologies, I don't have new jokes. I'm going to recycle old jokes because I do know the president of the Costa Rican Central Bank is here, and that does put a lot of pressure. And then this is co-author work with David Chor, and I'm also going to present new work that we're building on that previous presentation that is with Camelia, Marisa, and Andrea, that is trying to understand how these patterns came to be. And so I usually start this presentation by mentioning that all of my co-authors and myself, we're children of globalization. We were born in one country, we came to the US, and so we were part of this optimism of the 90s and 2000s, me being probably the oldest of the group, where we saw the changes associated with reductions of tariffs, policy barriers, and technological change that allow one firm to go to another country, hire labor, source inputs, and sell to another one. In the case of Costa Rica, Intel is the example of this process, and this supply chains revolution and this seek for efficiency and profit was about also bringing growth and development to many countries. And as I said, Costa Rica did witness some of these changes. My co-author is also from Singapore. So again, in many ways, we're part of this optimism. Fast forward to now, and then we're in this world where there are these concerns of natural disasters, this rethinking about the costs of globalization, in particular supply chains. There is this concern that they're actually exposing firms and countries to disruption risk. What is interesting is that this is also on the back of a backlash, mostly in developed countries, against globalization. This is work that I have been doing with David and Maggie, where we have been conducting representative samples surveys in the US since 2018, and we have documented not only on average people are now against trade, but also there's a trend to go that has been increasing. But perhaps for us, what is a little bit more disheartening is that even when we mention the benefits of trade or we mention the costs of the tariffs, we still find people are willing to impose tariffs, and in part because they cannot disassociate trade with China and loss of jobs. And I do mention that this is mostly in developed countries. It has also been documented in Europe and in others, But in developing countries, even though there's a trend, on average, there's still support for globalization. So we see this backlash, and in this backlash, we have seen rich countries reimpose tariffs, and this new view that perhaps trading with friends will reduce the risks. So in this paper, what we did, in the paper with David, what we did is we decided to take a broad view. We went back to the 90s. If you're as old as me, the 90s is not that long ago. If you're like my students, it's decades ago. Although I keep telling them we had better music. Maybe only Taylor Swift will survive this era, but that is fine. And so we go back and we look at partners, products, modes, a value chain position, and then we zoom in the last 5 years, 6 years, and look for hints of reshoring, nearshoring. And we advance 2 big points. The first one is, and again, this is also being said by other economists like Paul Antras and Penny Goldberg and Richard Baldwin, we are not seeing deglobalization yet. And I do stress the yet, but we're not seeing it. Even in the US, the last 5 years, 6 years have been years of growth in trade. And one does need to be careful, and again, many authors have said that, not to extrapolate the growth rates that we observed in the 90s and the growth rates we observe now as we're deglobalizing. Of course, after the 80s and 90s, we were going to see very high growth rates. The growth rates when you go from 0 to 1 to 2 are very different from the growth rates from 100, 101, and 102. Barriers, significant barriers, fell, and so we saw those high growth rates. We won't see them now. The other thing to be careful is that China reached levels of trade to GDP that one could argue were excessively high for a country that size, and perhaps they were not even optimal. And so China has also tried to rebalance their growth after the global financial crisis, trying to do more local consumption, more investment, and thus their trade to GDP has gone down. But again, one may argue that it could be optimal, but a lot of the changes are actually driven by China. Rich countries have actually maintained or increased their trade levels to GDP. So we're not seeing deglobalization, but we are seeing what we call the great reallocation of global value chains. And so we're seeing, from the point of view of the US, less trade with China as a market share. It used to be close to 22% imports. It went down to 16 in 2022. It is now close to 13. And who has taken that market share? It has been friends like Vietnam. It has been friends that are close by, like Mexico. So we look at these effects. And what is interesting is that these effects happen very quickly. There is a little appreciation of how quickly this reallocation has taken place. We usually tend to think that there are fixed costs, these relations take time to find, and thus they tend to stay for a while, and there was a very quick switch. And so in this new paper, we're trying to understand how this happened, and we explore the role of banks in allowing that very quick reallocation to happen. But then we also raise 2 points of caution. The first is this will be costly, as tariffs were costly, and there is enough evidence to show that the tariffs were paid by US consumers. The consumers are also probably going to pay the reallocation. So going to Vietnam and going to China, away from China, going to Vietnam and Mexico has higher unit costs, and also it may likely not reduce the total dependence from a firm that is owned by China. And again, the government is not trying to eliminate all trade with China. It's impossible. China is very big. It's supposed to be just from strategic products, but still it is likely that this won't happen. And so, as I said in the paper, we start going back and we look at the period in the 90s, and there's a little bit of a level problem here. My water keeps dropping, so hopefully this won't be a disaster. So, but the 90s already saw this big change where the US switched from high-income partners to lower-income partners. So this is the time where the US changed from Japan to China and from Canada to Mexico. And this is the gray line to the dashed line. And so we see this change. What is also interesting about the US, and we tend to talk a lot about global value chains, they are actually more regional than global. So in this period, even though there were substantial shocks, the US has maintained relatively constant market shares, with Europe close to 20%, and yes, I'm including the UK there, sorry UK. Asia is close to 40, NAFTA directly, or they can do it through FDI. This was the way that Japan dealt, and Japanese companies dealt with a lot of protectionism, but also higher costs in Japan. So all the stories we hear now about a country that has better cars, that they help with the environment, and there's also security concerns with semiconductors and some other things, were part of the 70s, 80s, 90s. And what did Japan do? Japan started to open plants in the US. So in fact, if you look at the direct involvement of a Japanese-owned firm via imports or FDI, the share of Japan is actually higher than China, and that is the blue line. And that is also true for other rich countries. So again, we like to stress the role of FDI because it has always been a way in which countries deal with barriers, but also increasing costs in their own country. And I'll come back to this point. China will try to do this. It's unlikely that they're going to be able to do it in the US, but will try to engage also in FDI to go around barriers. The other thing we do is we summarize US exports and imports through a measure that was developed by my co-author, David, that is called the upstreamness of exports-imports trade. So a product is very downstream if it's very close to the final product. So think textiles, think toys. Those directly go to the final product. A product is very upstream if it has to go certain stages before it reaches the final consumer. Think semiconductors, think chemicals, think oil. So you can see from the figure that on average, US exports have always been higher upstream than the imports. What is also interesting is that even though imports were relatively downstream, around the 2010, there was a big dive, and they became even more downstream. This is associated with the US energy independence. So it's not only that the US shale and oil, there was production boom, the US has become more energy efficient. And so this has meant that the US turned from a net importer of energy to a net exporter. And that means that the imports are now more downstream. And we also like to stress this because countries are trying to deal with climate change. A lot of the energy for climate change, as of right now, is very non-tradable. And so this probably will look like deglobalization because countries are not going out to buy oil, but it's not really deglobalization the way we think about it. It's just the outcome of, as of right now, a lot of these energies are very non-tradable. And so we also like to stress that the fight of climate may look like deglobalization, but it's not really what we have in mind as deglobalization. So then we zoom in to the last 5 years, and as I said, this is a period where the US real imports grew by 6.7. In fact, if you go to 2023, they grew in real terms by 10%. This is a time also where imports from China grew up to 2022. 2023, they went down because there's a price effect. But overall, the US has been out there trading. However, what is clear is this reallocation. And so you see the loss of market share by China, close to 5 percentage points. And if China and Asia loses, Asia wins. Vietnam has won. What we call high-income Asia has won. That is Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. What is middle-income Asia has won. That is India, Thailand, and Malaysia. Who else has won? NAFTA. In fact, that managed to reverse some of the losses of Canada, and Mexico has also increased. At that time, last year, we stressed a lot the role of Mexico because Mexico already had a very high and deep integration with the US, and there's gaining more. It turns out that right now, the biggest market share win, if you are 2023, has been Mexico. And China has lost 8 percentage points, which is close to 1/3 of the share with the US. We also plot the 4, if you want, buckets of products or sectors that have dominated policy debates. That is auto parts, semiconductors, and electronics. And if you do a little bit of eyeball econometrics, you can see some of the changes. Semiconductors is evident. You do see China losing market share. You see high-income Asia winning market share. But you see it also in electronics. You see it in cars, especially with Mexico, and auto parts also with Vietnam. And so in the paper, we do a little bit of econometrics, which I know probably doesn't fit well with this glorious location in Florida, but it's nice to do a little bit of econometrics every morning before you go and enjoy the sun and the waves. And the reason why we like to stress these econometrics is that what we do is, let me find a 4-digit product that used to be traded in China. Can I find it in Vietnam? Can I find it in Mexico? Can I find it in high-income Asia, middle-income Asia, or Europe? It turns out these countries pretty much span the changes in the US market share. So it's not mechanical that this has to add to one, but you see that the rest of the world is not significant. These pretty much account for a lot of the chain. Ireland and Switzerland, a lot of it was also related with COVID. But the other thing that we do is plot, and I don't know if you can see, Vietnam and Mexico. And here, what I want to stress, you know, there is this movement to try to get kids out of TikTok. If you want kids to get out of TikTok, give them trade data. Give them trade data at 4 digits, give them trade data at 6 digits. You're gonna see, you go into the rabbit hole and you start looking, 85, what is 85? It's the electronics, and this is transport, and this is metals. They may even pick up a periodic table to find out why there's so many metals being traded, and what are the ceramics, and what are the glass. But what I want you to see, and you will see also that you will go into the rabbit hole of trade data, is Mexico has a lot of 4 digits. It is very dense. I have always known the relation Mexico-US was important. Quantitatively, I was not aware how deep it was. Every 4-digit product is there. It's not the same as Vietnam, and in fact, that's why we had to do 4 digits, because if we went 6, I would find them in Mexico, I wouldn't find them in Vietnam. So it is a very deep relation in products. It was a very deep relation in quantities, and it is increasing. And so, again, we go into the rabbit hole of the 4 digits, and we try to get a sense of what was going on. So Vietnam is very downstream. It is textiles. It is wood, plastic wood floor coverings. Everything that you go into a house and you think is wood is not. It's plastic, and it comes from Vietnam. So already a lot of that was coming, but Vietnam is going a little bit upstream, electronics, microphones, but it is still very labor intensive. Mexico, on the other hand, is everything. It is everything you can think of. It's there, from electronics to cars to everything. It does seem to suggest that more than labor share is associated with the fact that they're close and they already have very deep supply networks. And so it's the movement to Mexico. What is clear from all of the regressions is that tariffs played a role. Some firms were moving, but tariffs made firms move faster. And so that is caution number 1. This is likely to have costs. So we look at unit costs. Unit cost is a proxy of the value. It could be a proxy of quality, but in this case, we argue it's more a proxy of cost. And products that used to be in China that are now being brought from Vietnam are close to 10% more expensive. Products that used to be in China are now being brought from Mexico are close to 3–4% more expensive. With this data, I cannot tell you if it's supply or demand, because as I told you, all the Trump tariffs were passed to the consumers. So if I'm a firm now doing it in Vietnam, I have that I can pass to consumers. But from talking, the speed this has happened does seem to be associated with increasing costs of production, and so it is likely to be a mix of supply and demand. And so this that I just told you, it's all at the trade level. So we try to find and aggregate it at the firm level to find intent. And so we use data from Tarek Hassan from earning calls, and we go and look, I was in China, am I trying to open in Vietnam, am I trying to open in Mexico? And you do see a spike in the data. Oops. You do see a spike in the data where it is a strategy to conduct business, and you do see that in the data. But as I mentioned, most of the analysis so far has been at the trade level, but not at the firm level. And so we want to explore a little bit more these changes at the firm level. And as I said, it is unappreciated, this amount of fixed costs that exist to be able to do trade abroad, to the point that the average firm or the medium firm actually only has one supplier in another country. So it is specifications of the product you have. It also takes time. You need to go in a boat, find the product. Again, there is a fixed cost, and the typical is you only do one. And this change was extremely fast. So in the paper with Camelia and other co-authors, we're trying to understand what enabled this extremely fast transformation of the US supply chain abroad. And what we do is we get this data set that is from Panjiva that allows us to map firms to suppliers and products. It is shipping, so we are limited to things that happen in Asia relative to Mexico. A lot of the trade with Mexico happens with trucks, so we focus on Asia. And we first document at the firm level, because this data is at the firm level, that indeed, these patterns that we saw in the trade data at the firm level. It is associated with firms changing their supplier relations. They're doing less from China and more from Asia. But we wanted to understand a little bit more what enabled this. And so, again, this is just trying to do that same regression that we did at the trade level, at the firm level, and we do find that there are now doing less suppliers in China, they're entering less in China, they're entering more in Asia, and the net is now higher in Asia. But as I said, we want to find out why this was able to happen so fast. If the literature tells us, and what has been documented to date, is that these relations tend to be very sticky. And of course, we look into the role of banks. Why do we look at the role of banks? Because banks, specialized banks, that is what they do. They're supposed to provide information to clients. If you're a specialized bank, you have better knowledge, you can help your firms do that. But also relationship banking is about understanding your customer better. It's about understanding the firm that you lend to better. And so this was a moment that we argue this relationship banking should be able to allow the firms to exploit the knowledge and the relation to try to enter into Asia and some other countries. And so that is the hypothesis that we test. Banks enable firms to do this reallocation very quickly. And indeed, looking in general, we do find that there was increase in the use of credit lines, there was increase in the use of credit, there was also a lower cost, an increase in the cost and in the loan amount. So there was clearly an increase in demand. Firms wanted to borrow to be able to cover these fixed costs, trying to find a new firm in another country, set up the shop, so on and so forth. Increase in demand. But then we tried to find out if the banks that had better knowledge helped their clients, and we do find evidence of that. It turns out that if you were in a special banking relationship, you were charged lower interest rates. So there was an advantage to this process that we're trying to understand what has enabled this change, and indeed, banks were doing the job at the right time to the right firms. And so then we go and also present caution number 2. As I said, the way Japan dealt with a lot of trade costs, Japan was developing is paying higher wages. It was Japan opened shops somewhere else. This is also what China is doing. So it has always been an explicit policy of China not to set FDI in Mexico. And in fact, when you go and look at the FDI data in Mexico, it's overwhelmingly US. China always considered Mexico as a competitor. That is changing. So Mexico has very good data. So you can find at 4-digit, 6-digit of trade, ownership of the foreign firm, and location. And if you look at the aggregate, it is still US. If you look at two sectors, auto and auto parts, 75% of all new FDI is China. And again, it is going into some other sectors. So it used to be a competitor. Now they're using Mexico as a potential way to deal with all these tariffs. China has always been in Vietnam. Vietnam doesn't have the great data that Mexico has, but Nina Pavnik from Dartmouth has studied the case of Vietnam, and indeed, there is different sources from US, other Asian countries, but China has always had a presence in Vietnam, and it's also increasing, and it's interesting that it's increasing during COVID. So one way they're gonna get around is FDI, and the other is when we look at the US main trade partners, in every single one of them, China's increasing market share, except Japan. If you look at G20 countries, in every single one of G20 countries, China is either number 1 or number 2. I was in Brazil last week. Electric cars, guess where they're coming from? And every other Uber had an electric car. So penetration. So again, the policy is not to eliminate dependence of China. It cannot be done. But it is likely that it will be very difficult to end dependence from a firm that is owned by China because of the different modes of entry. This is just, again, to underscore Mexico has become the main trade partner and the main changes, but it was always there. But what is interesting is Mexico has never seen the level of imports of capital goods and the share of investment in 20 years. And I mention this because it's very hard to see FDI data at the macro level in Mexico and growth and productivity, but when you go to the micro data, you see it there. There is a transformation in Mexico, again, even with the deep integration they already had with the US. Is the US nearshoring? So remember the upstreamness measure. When you go at the end of the period, you do see a little bit of an increase in US imports. And so one could argue that those things that were very downstream that used to be imported, now they're produced in the US. But again, it's very hard to tell. A lot of these changes are happening. A lot of the investment announcements, as of right now, you do see an increase in semiconductors. So it is possible that a lot of the change will happen in semiconductors. So to conclude, we are seeing the great reallocation of global value chain from the point of view of the US. Friends are gaining market share. Countries that are close by are earning market share. And perhaps some evidence of reshoring, but again, it's very early to talk about that. But caution, this will be costly. This reallocation is happening faster than probably firms would have done it, and it will have implications in terms of unit cost. And also, China is also reallocating, so it's yet to be seen what will be the final effects. Having said that, we do find that banks played a big role in allowing this reallocation, and for that, sound banks were helpful in allowing the firms and relationship banking to undertake a lot of these changes. Having said that, we do conclude the paper by saying that a lot of this policy, it would be nice if there's some cost evaluation, social evaluation of what is the impact and what are the benefits, again, once the data is available. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. Our discussant for the paper is Julian Di Giovanni. He's Department Head of Climate Risk Studies in the Research and Statistics Group at the New York Fed. Thanks for being willing to discuss these papers. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camelia. Thank you for inviting me and to the organizers as well for setting up a great conference so far. Okay, so I got to discuss two papers, which is very nice. So it's going to be a bit of a broad discussion. But to help fix ideas first, what is a global supply chain? I thought it would be useful to put up the global supply chain of our favorite mobile device, the Apple iPhone, just to give an idea, what's going on around the world. Ideas come from Silicon Valley, but then Apple sources, different parts of the iPhone from all over the world before final assembly and production takes place in China, and the good is shipped to customers all over the place. Recently, I don't know. You might have seen in the news that Foxconn, the major assembler of the iPhone in China, indeed Apple still seems to be very entrenched in China, but it does give you an idea that not just looking at specifically US imports, as Laura and her co-authors do, but just thinking about the whole supply chain of a large US firm, right? Shifts are happening. And what this might mean for the future is definitely an interesting question to think about, and something that Laura's papers have really made me think about over the last couple of weeks quite a bit. Okay, so what are we doing here? Two papers that use a lot of data at different levels of granularity. So just to give a brief summary, paper one with Davin Chor focuses on U.S. firms changing sources of intermediate inputs over a 5-year period, including COVID. We should take into account. They explore sector-level measures, supply chain positions, as well as earnings calls, FDI data. So there's a lot going on here. But the three, I would say, punchlines that Laura elucidated already is the notion that U.S. are shifting away, at least at the product level, from Chinese suppliers to friends, Mexico, Vietnam, et cetera. But there might be potential costs for this, namely increase in unit value of products. And in truth, they might not be diversifying so much when you start looking at FDI data and seeing that maybe some of these Mexican firms are all of a sudden being bought up by Chinese firms or represent Chinese affiliates. So paper two goes into even more granular data, and they take this Pangaea supplier, kind of basically what U.S. firm, Pangaea sources from U.S. Customs, where every firm in the U.S. economy sources their goods from, okay, at least for the first stage. And think about this and merge it with credit registry data for the U.S. So it's a huge data set, provides a lot of granular information, and then they can start thinking about more facts on supplier chain linkages as well as how these changes are financed. Okay, so what do they find? Well, first, like paper one, they find that the tariffs tended to force some substitution away from Chinese direct suppliers towards other friendly countries. And along the way, U.S. firms, U.S. importers specifically, demanded more credit for these changes. Okay? Now, there's a discussion that this might be also indicating of some type of financial constraints. And the authors note, for example, that depending on the banking relationship a given U.S. importer has, might lead to easier access to credit or a larger import share, which they kind of take as easier access to credit, or lower credit costs. Okay. All right, so my discussion, there's a lot of facts here, so I'm going to zoom out. I'm an international macroeconomist, although I work with microdata as well, but I thought it'd be nice to first think about what globalization has looked at like in a few figures to date over the last 200 years, then think about a bit more about these micro facts and what they might mean for macro risk, and in particular, what I would think about as supply chain resilience. Okay? And I'll leverage some work I've done on this. And finally, I'm going to hopefully get some specific comments that are useful on the two papers along the way. Okay, so first, let's look at how world trade has evolved over time. So we can think about it as really two waves of globalization over the last 200 years. So kind of the pre-World War II, where we're plotting world trade over total world GDP, a growth in trade. Well, the World War I and World War II, I should say, kind of stopped that quite a while. It was a similar picture, in fact, for capital flows. And then, particularly since the 1980s, trade has boomed around the world. Okay, so there's exponential growth until the global financial crisis, where it has slowed down. And as Laura mentioned in her discussion, this is actually to be expected on some level, given the high growth rates they saw in the previous couple of decades. So what might have been driving such changes? Well, first, both shipping and communication costs have fallen quite a lot over time. And indeed, there's a beautiful paper by Kei-Mu Yi, and he wrote it actually when he was at the New York Fed, which shows that even small changes in trade costs can have huge changes on trade flows around the world once you start actually factoring in these supply chains, because it's just going to, as the chain gets longer and longer and more trade kind of flows through it, since it's in gross terms, it's just going to get larger in actual numbers. Okay? Two, obviously, China. Not just China, but I would say the world trade regime, started to liberalize a lot more, but you do have what I call the China shock when they entered the WTO, especially in the 2000s, that really expanded the availability of cheap labor for firms to try to outsource, produce new goods. Okay? So all this arguably has also led to kind of very complex global production networks to develop. And here I'm giving a couple of pretty complex looking pictures, but kind of what we can embed in our macro models to think about how shocks might spill over across countries as well as across industries. So on the blue ones, and this is from a paper from the co-authors, capture just nodes that are linking countries with their two largest trading partners. Okay, so in fact, at the country level, the network is actually even more complex than what this looks like. Okay, and then we scale it. It's scaled by size of the country, by the actual flows. So that's the blue. And on the right side, on the red, it's across industries. So this is using sector-level data, not firm-level data. Okay, and just to make the point, you put these two together, and you have a very, very complex kind of interweaving of transactions around the world in international trade, both across manufacturing sectors, how manufacturing sector spills into services, et cetera. And all this matters, when we want to think about, in particular, shock propagation, what we saw during COVID, inflation, spillovers, et cetera. Okay. So going forward, with all this friendshoring, reshoring, et cetera, is the world facing, or is the US in particular, facing fewer or greater risks? Okay, so perhaps the globalization party, as we know it, is over. And given COVID, geopolitics, climate risk, there's a lot of reasons to think that, yeah, the world is definitely going to be changing. But then a question arises, will friendshoring or reshoring even make the US economy more resilient, at least on the production side? And I would say applies to all countries around the world. So a priori, at least to my thinking of the problem, not so obvious. Okay, why? Well, I just showed you a production network that looks pretty complex, right? And as Laura was explaining, for example, even Mexican firms might be held by Chinese companies. So that's as long as we have these production networks going, the world isn't in isolation. To give a more specific example, so a little self-advertisement, apologies, but some joint work with Cemnem Ozkan, Alvaro Silva, and Mohamed Yildirim, we construct a large model of global production linkages to think about kind of how shocks transmitted throughout the world during the COVID year in particular. And what such models show is that there's a slew of things we have to think about when thinking about spillovers in the production networks around the world. For example, both domestic and foreign aggregate demand shocks will impact inflation. We kind of understand this from basic macro models, but then you kind of drill down and start realizing, well, what's going on at the sector level matters as well, right? In terms of productivity shocks, in terms of factor supplies, right? You close one factory in China, workers can't go to work, this is going to spill over everywhere. Moreover, kind of global imbalances, we've always thought about this in terms of capital flows or savings and investment. It also matters in terms of demand and in particular sectors as well, or these kind of bottlenecks can be created. So, in thinking about kind of resilience, we have to go look beyond just where firms are sourcing and think about, where, kind of the whole chain, the global production network, as well as the source and types of shocks that might be hitting the economy going forward. And in that lens, think about this in terms of resilience. Okay, so maybe getting to the papers a bit more. So paper number 1, okay, think about the micro facts. So, as I've already mentioned, thinking about the global network is, I think, paramount. But even in what I would call a partial equilibrium analysis, just focusing on what's going on in the US specifically, one question comes out is like, how many Vietnams are needed to replace one China? So I think Laura was very, very upfront about, we're not getting rid of China altogether. But, for me at least, calculations given the regression results. Turning to the unit, kind of the rising unit costs, the big question was like, what are they capturing? Is it more expensive factor costs in sourcing countries? Indeed, China, the real wages have been going up quite a lot over time already. So we might have already expected some of this kind of firms searching for cheaper locations. Okay? Larger transport costs. Are these setup or switching costs, are they transitory or are they longer run? I mean, to think about kind of what might go on with unit costs going forward, or inflation in particular, is it a one-time change, or is it something kind of that we have to worry about reshuffling going on all the time? And of course, general equilibrium effect of things like tariffs obviously are going to spill over and impact costs from goods coming from other countries. Okay, so paper 2, which is definitely more of a work in progress, so I think the rest of my time I'll just spend on comments here. So first, it provides some super interesting complementary evidence on the friendshoring using these more granular data. And so I'm in the world of macro networks. I've fortunately never had to work with like firm level supplier data, but it's huge. So just everyone should be applauding just for them working on these data. It took a lot of time, I have no doubt. Okay? And what they find is indeed, just like with the product level, they find that US firms increase the number of non-Chinese suppliers and decrease the Chinese ones over the time period during the first trade war. Okay? So again, I came back to ask, will this necessarily dampen the potential risks to production chains and overall macro risk? So the answer is, it depends. Key question is how diversified are firms, and Laura presented something about, the average firm has only one importer. Indeed, I've worked a lot with French data, not US data, but you see the similar patterns across countries. And in particular, firms tend to not diversify very much. And even when they do, these large kind of conglomerates, even within the product level, they tend to be very specialized. So it's not obvious that, first that firms really want to diversify so much, but even when they do, they might still skew, like have one super important supplier or one super important export market. And in that case, idiosyncratic shocks, whether it be a climate event, something going on in the country specifically, might still have a large effect. So even firms might look a bit diversified, it's not necessarily the case. Secondly, of course, it depends on the ease of shifting production, both within a firm, across firms, across countries. And while it does look like, it's interesting, the US firms did adapt quite quickly given the 2017-18 events going forward, it still takes time, right? We definitely saw it during COVID. Of course, it was a world shock, but firms could not nimbly jump around so easily. And in general, kind of what we, in economics, about elasticities of substitution matter a lot. And in general, we think they're quite low in the short run versus being higher in the long run. Short run, think business cycle, long run, 5, 10 years out. Okay, so all this is important to think about taking these results in context going forward. Okay, so some more specific questions. So the paper was very much, Laura mentioned fixed costs and thinking about what firms have to overcome to find new suppliers. They used the language of the paper very much about search costs. Okay, so it naturally, kind of led to the question, what are the costs faced by US importers in getting new suppliers? And they only have indirect evidence, but for sure there's other business costs to find new suppliers. That needs upfront financing. So it would be useful to see if also these firms in their sample are, accessing trade credit, which, maybe some of this information is, is available at the bank or the firm levels, for example, looking at accounts receivables, et cetera. A second point, which is, and this paper focuses more on exports, but it's something that I think is often overlooked, is that there's a natural network effect that domestic firms might take advantage when entering into foreign markets. So there's a very nice paper by Thomas Chanet in the AER, where he makes the point that it's, the more kind of foreign, if you're a US firm, the more US firms that are in Vietnam, the easier it might be for a new US firm to access Vietnam, and at a lower cost. So I think this is actually something you could probably control for using your data, and it would just be interesting to see if we see such patterns in the data. My second question really, what are firm financial constraints? So this is all very reduced form, and I know it's a very hard question to get in general. Okay? So the authors try to control for it using what I call non-time varying fixed effects, et cetera, or predetermined variables. But more generally, we could think that as tariffs were put in place, et cetera, that that firms might become more risky. Okay? Those who are already in China might be viewed as more risky by banks, et cetera. So there might be just some interrelated relationships that they should think about in the data. But more generally, if firms appear to be getting the necessary credit for finances, so that they can actually create these new supply relationships, what are the constraints? So I got stuck a bit thinking about, or asking myself, what is the counterfactual? Is it that firms should have gotten even more access to more loans so they could develop even more relationships? Or is it simply that they're paying a higher cost of credit? But to me, at least I do my crosses right, like higher demand usually kind of increases price, so you would think that perhaps they would be actually getting higher rates. So it wasn't obvious to me that there's a particularly financial constraint going on in their analysis. Okay. And my final question was really, how to interpret the results on the banking relationships, which I think stood in a bit for an easing of financial constraints. First, banks specializing in foreign markets may have followed other domestic firms that are already there, Right? So there's this, so these regressions, bank specializations might be picking up this firm network effect that I mentioned from the Chanet paper. Okay? And to be quite clear, I'm not a banking person. I do work, though, with a lot of financial people, including Christian Blickel, who has a very nice paper on bank specialization. And their story in this paper is essentially that specialized banks kind of are able to cherry pick better firms. Okay, so maybe it's not so surprising that they're also offering better terms to their loans. Okay, and more generally, firms that can borrow from many banks, are they better than firms that can borrow from only from one bank, or are they just kind of spreading? When you're borrowing from many banks, in general, you're just kind of spreading your risk across. So again, banks are willing to offer you better terms of your loan. Okay, so I guess in econometric parlance, I was worried a bit about selection in your results. Okay, so finally, some concluding remarks. I enjoyed reading both papers, gave me a lot to think about. Globalization as we know it might be over, and we're heading towards a more fragmented trade regime. Okay, so I think this has implications for both real economy and, of course, financial markets, what it might mean for capital flows, but I don't have any time to talk about that today. There's a ton of work going on at multilateral institutions thinking about such questions, particularly the IMF, Pierre-Olivier Gourin-Chasse and Guito Corbinaf, and the research group are working on thinking about polarization, what this might mean overall. But that's more at a macro level. So documenting all these micro facts in these two papers, super interesting, very complementary. We have to understand kind of the micro mechanisms to understand how the macro models are working, which is just to conclude important for both researchers like myself as well. I guess I am now the New York Fed, policymakers as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julian. Laura, any comments, any responses?
No, first, let me thank Julian because one paper is published and the other one is work in progress, and I do appreciate that does impose a task. And so all your suggestions, all well taken. Some of the things you mentioned we have done, and we need to update the paper, but let me just give some broad thoughts. What we do think is very interesting about this episode is that it did happen very quickly. And so it is hard to use existing measures of substitution because they're not going to map well. But it did happen very quickly. And I also think of financial constraints not in general. I think financial constraints are a T. If I can borrow to buy a house, I can self-save and after 40 years, buy the house. Alternative, a bank can look at me and say, yes, she has a stable job, she's tenured, she's not going to get kicked out, so I can lend her instead of self-saving. But that's why I do think financial constraints have a T. Will someone give me the money that I need now? And I think that's this case. The firms needed to react quickly because there was the tariffs, and banks were able to see, yes, at this point, I know you don't have it, you could self-save, but you need the money now, and that's what happened. But we do need to be clearer on that. The point on the network is well taken, but again, I think there is this fact that we tend to forget, and in part because we're always thinking about Apple, but the typical firm has just one supplier. It's the folks I found in Mexico when I went there, that they are sourcing one thing from Mexico. It is not this complex Apple world. And in that world that you only source from one place, there's not a lot of externalities in terms of network. There are externalities that are more complex, that are in terms of logistics, and knowing someone who knows someone who can tell me about that place. But we do need to control about that. The other thing is, I agree, it's always better to have a framework. It turns out we have the census. We do know what span the change in China, and that was the regressions of table 1. It was those countries. Those countries accounted for that change in China, and I can tell you in the last 6 years, the countries that accounted for the change in China. It's a little bit more complex if we want to forecast. And I agree that for that we do need a model, but right now we're trying to be more positive than normative. In the world of normative, there's a lot of work that is coming out on what is the optimal. Helfman from the economic department is producing a lot of these great papers. And in general, there's always this, that diversification is the best strategy, much more than nearshoring, reshoring. It just have different suppliers, but it does have a cost, which was the reason why firms didn't do it. But the bigger question of, is this building resilience? This is the question that we do need a theoretical and empirical work to try to understand if indeed we're making the world more resilient. And I say that because, again, I am a globalization child. I was born in one country, studied another. My husband is for a third. And so these changes that all think that the world with less trade is better make me nervous. But also, I think we were very quick to judge trade as the reason we had problems in COVID, and it's actually the opposite. Trade helped the US in COVID. There was no world that the US would have consumed the amount it consumed if the US had been self-sufficient. So I think we need to keep in mind that there might be advantages of world trade. And the last thing I want to say is this work that we have done is in goods. There's an obsession about goods, but the US is a service economy. The US actually has a trade surplus in services. Services have continued to grow. The 4 sectors that I put represent 20% of manufacturing, which represents 9% of US employment. And so all of the employment in the US is in services, and perhaps we also should think about them. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. So let me just say many thanks for all the questions that are coming here to the iPad, and please keep up voting them. I am actually going to start with a question that's a little bit more technical and then go to the big policy questions. Which
might be weird because you may be able to answer it better.
I just want to put to rest some concerns about data. When we work with so much data, we want to make sure that it's representative of the activities we're looking at. So a question from Ian. The US data on imports from China are 130 billion lower, almost 25% than Chinese estimates of their exports to the US. This gap only opened up with the expansion of tariffs from 2020. Might we just be seeing US companies under-recording shipments?
So there is, I forget the name, but if you look at the US trade data, there is everything else clause, and that's the one that has been increasing. And many people have argued that that is, some of these things that pay tariffs are going there. And actually, in the work we did, we control a little bit about that, but it is what it is. If it's non-classified, I forgot the name, but it has a name. And that one has increased, and it is possible that is going there. But yes, if it's not classified, it's very hard for us to fix it. But point well taken.
The next question is for the both of you. So this is stepping back from this entire body of work. I have two questions that speak to the same topic, which is the impact of supply chain disruptions on inflation. So let me quickly run through the questions. First one to Laura. Is the right interpretation of your research on the Great Reallocation that it produces relative price shifts that are not inflationary in the sense that they are one-time shifts in costs?
Our work is about levels, indeed. These are reallocation costs. They may show up in the data as inflation because they may not necessarily pass in 1 year. If they pass over several years, they will be counted as inflation. But inflation, as we all know everywhere, and from Latin America, is always about printing. So we're picking up relative changes. The one thing is that these tariffs keep coming, and there are threats of more tariffs. And so it is also possible that firms may be anticipating and passing before the changes. But yes, these are relative changes.
Perfect. And just to add on, and then also ask Julian for his thoughts, what are the implications of the reallocation in global supply chain for US consumer price inflation, and over what horizon should we think about them? And feel free to draw more broadly on your own research in tackling that question.
So on the reallocation, I mean, again, I think Laura said it's not obvious. If these are just one-time costs, then it's not going to feed directly into inflation. I mean, in the short run, you can imagine that there will be price hikes, so it'll show up in inflationary, but long run, it's hard to say. I mean, and indeed, at the end of the day, I mean, these are supply shocks. So I think more research is coming on this. Central banks can, if it's relative price changes, it's possible that they can fight against it. Obviously, there's trade-offs to do it.
Okay. Let me follow up with another question that kind of ties us back to an earlier discussion about the very, very fast technological improvement we're seeing, AI and so on. Do you feel that there's an interaction between the great reallocation and technology transformation? In particular, what do you think is the role of new technologies in explaining some of the speed and pattern of reallocation that you see in your work?
I don't think the speed that we see is driven by AI just because this starts in 2017 and it might be just too early to pick up AI. We might see it later. The work we're doing also matching the credit registry is before COVID, so it is not likely to see the effects of AI. But it is asking a broader question of what's going to happen. As I said, the US leads the way in trade in services, and it has been multinationals that lead the way in trade in services. There are also the ones leading the way in AI. And so it is possible that the effect will be seen more there than in other parts. And that is the question, what's going to happen there? That concern is being felt by countries that are on the other side. I was at a panel discussing India, and India, they worry about that. What's AI going to do to all the trade in services? I don't think the data has yet to pick it up, but it's coming.
Speaking to the second paper you presented on the role of the banking sector and the resilient banking sector in sort of helping buffer some of these shocks, does the analysis of banks' role suggest anything about how banking structure relates to lowering the cost of adjustment through the provision of credit? For example, the relative role of large versus small banks or domestic banks versus foreign banks. So when you think about specialized banks, is it more the domestic ones, the ones with global footprint? How should we think about how the US banking structure speaks to that reallocation?
I'm going to answer this question, but you need to check if what I'm saying is correct or not. So the data set has a threshold, and so it's relatively larger banks to begin with. So it's not about the little Brookline bank in the corner of Brookline. It does speak about banks that have a global footprint because we do many robustness checks, and some are related to banks that do trade activities, and those tend to have a global footprint. The specialized banks as well is that they tend to have a lot of their activities in trading. So it does seem to go there, but again, my own co-author should check on. You had a question about trade credits. We actually checked, and there was no reaction by Chinese firms once you put all the fixed effects to try to keep US firms with trade credits. So it doesn't seem to, there doesn't seem to be a lot of action there, but again, it's a relatively recent result, and we need to explore more.
Excellent. So I'm going to use the last 40 seconds or so to just ask the mother of all questions. What are the policy implications of the great descriptive evidence you have provided? And I'm going to let you put meat on that question, because it's sufficiently broad.
I don't think the US has done a proper cost evaluation of any of these policies. As I have said in the past, I'm a student of Harberger. We do have in the economic profession tools to evaluate cost benefits of policy intervention. It is true that a lot of the policy is still taking place, and true evaluation is exposed once the policy has been taken out. So it's hard to know. As I said, we do have evidence that the consumers paid for all the tariffs, which is bizarre if you think about it, because in general, is the country with that is less elastic, that has less possibility to substitute, that takes the cost of a tariff. And it's bizarre that it was the US. One would have thought that it would be China, but it was the US, so we know that. Consumers pay for it, and we know that there was welfare reduction. There's a paper by Amity Weinstein and Steve Redding. The only way I'm going to qualify what I just said is that we economists do not have good quantitative models to think about national security. And as I said, in the paper I have done with Chor and Maggie Chen, there is this big concern in the US that people cannot disentangle jobs from China and some broader concerns of national security. And I think we economists are very good at coming up with many things and upsetting other social sciences, but we should do some effort to try to quantify the effects of national security to get a sense if indeed what consumers are paying more justifies the concerns of national security.
Well, with that, I'll say thank you, Laura. Thank you, Julian. And we have lunch next, and I will invite you all to join us back at 7 p.m. for dinner and keynote address with Professor Ed Glazer. Thank you.